G'day guys! Today I had a conversation with Jeremy Martino about the upcoming Uprising Australian ITC Championships, which is held on the same weekend as the Las Vegas Open. We talked in detail about Chaos Space Marines and World Eaters. We discussed the state of those factions, as well as some combos that you may not know about that we're predicting are going to make a huge splash in these upcoming major events. So if you want to check that out, stay tuned to the end of the video so you don't miss anything. And with that being said, let's get stuck into it.
Look for the blood god.
Alright, Jez, we've got two of the largest events coming up. We've got the Australian ITC Championships Uprising here in Australia and Adelaide, and then we've got the LVO coming up. You've been playing pretty much exclusively Chaos Space Marines since the launch of 10th edition, so you've got a lot of expertise in it.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on the state of the faction coming up into these epic events that we're about to go through?
Yeah, I mean, I think CSM, as has been demonstrated from recent big tournaments, are definitely one of the best lists in the game, one of the best factions in the game at the moment. And I think they have received some nerfs. We've seen a few nerfs, most recently in the balanced data slate, which was a while ago now, but we did receive some nerfs. And I believe there is a balanced data slate on the way, but it won't affect these two tournaments.
Correct. The GW have announced that it's coming out after.
Right.
After LVO and this event, the Uprising Australian Championships, the same weekend, so it will be after that, which is fantastic. Last year it came out like the week before and absolutely just flipped the whole meta on its head with 1 week notice.
Yeah, that was funny.
Which was a nightmare. But
yeah, so I mean, I think CSM in a really good spot, and I think for Chaos players, obviously we're, you know, and I'm not a career Chaos player unlike yourself. Like you've been playing Chaos for what, 15 years now?
Yeah, something like that. Embarrassingly long.
I've dabbled with Chaos throughout points within my 40k history, but this is the longest I've ever played Chaos at one time. And I think for players, and obviously a lot of people that follow your channel are like lifelong Chaos fans, I think this is like a really strong point in the history of CSM. Not because CSM haven't had good points in history, but because the whole faction is really strong at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that for me makes Chaos Space Marines the strongest faction is that there's actually quite a bit of diversity in the lists that you can construct. And as a result, it's overall the faction is good. Like, do you want to include demon allies? Yes or no? There's arguments for that. Do you want to include a couple of war dogs? You can do that. There's a few different ways that you can write a chaos list. There's a lot of diversity within the faction. So, what are your thoughts on the staple units? There's plenty of staple units that people tend to gravitate towards. I think a lot of them are probably going to be relatively obvious to people, but just give us sort of your take
well,
on
I mean, I think the one thing that allows for such a broad reach of units is that the Marks of Chaos rule that gives you the kind of exploding, well critical hits, basically.
Yeah.
So you're getting critical hits, or whether it's sustained or
lethal
on a whole army. That's a really strong rule, because coming from someone that played Sisters of Battle last edition, or that was the previous army I was playing, and normally you'd run the Sacred Rite to get exploding sixes in combat.
Yep.
And that's something I used to run on Repentia, you'd have it on Zephyrum,
was only getting it on sixes, only on key units, and also only in combat. This is getting it on every unit in shooting and melee, and on fives.
Sometimes,
often.
And that's the thing, I think, when you kind of look at it, and you really enjoyed playing that on Sisters, you look at that army-wide, it's a really strong base to build on as an army. So because all your units are getting that ability, it kind of means all your units in some ways can be good, because they're all going to have exploding, at the very least, exploding sixes, but as you said, in some cases, exploding fives. So you've got people out there on the fringes that will run units of, like, for example, units of cultists, just with their auto guns and a couple of special weapons in there, run them as Zinj cultists because they get exploding fives and shooting, and they just blast people with
lethal hits.
Lethal hits. Sorry. And they'll just go, here's a bunch of wounds from cultists. So to start, you've got the really broad base, as we know.
Yep.
But then you kind of narrow in and say, well, what are the best things, the things that the best data sheets, or the things that benefit most? And then we hit to that rung of units that we all know about. And I think in the current meta, because we haven't hit the data slate, those same units that have been strong for a while are still really strong. And I think we can probably list them almost on one hand. If I had to list in ranking the strongest Chaos units at the moment, my number one unit would be Chosen.
Yep.
Chosen are very versatile and do so many things really well. So for example, their combat's very strong. They have 4 base attacks across all the units. So even the Power Fist model in the unit has 4 attacks.
Yep.
So that's really strong. They advance, shoot, and charge, and fall back. So they get to fall back, shoot and charge, or advance, shoot and charge.
Which is bananas. It's like they might as well just say this unit doesn't follow the rules. And it means that you can use them aggressively, but you can also use them to advance onto an objective and cleanse it. So they've got a massive amount of utility.
They have so much utility in that, as you said, they can come out of a Rhino and make the long bomb really far charge. Or if you have like 2 models left in the unit, a few models left, you go, well, this is a unit that I'm going to cleanse with.
Yeah.
They're so flexible in that respect. That rule alone is essentially what lifts Chosen up from a lot of the other units or not so much other units in the Codex, but similar units in other codices.
Yes, correct.
So you go, okay, like you pick out some Marines, like Black Templars. You pick out certain Marines and go, well, can they do that? Oh, they can't.
Yeah.
So that's what makes Chosen that level above.
The profile of the Chosen versus the profile of like Sword Brethren or whatever is more or less the same, but that ability really dials them up.
Exactly. So I think Chosen are the best unit in the Codex, but they're the current best meta unit.
Yep.
Then we look at similar units or things that empower Chosen. I think when you're looking at Chosen, a lot of people will pick out the Chaos Lord and say Chaos Lord is a broken unit. Chaos Lord is a broken unit. It is a very strong unit for several reasons. The reason why the Chaos Lord is so strong, in my opinion, is that it can be attached to Chosen.
Yeah.
Because if you look at a Chaos Lord and say, well...
Chaos Lord with Legionaries is just like, why
it's
bother?
real, unless they're Slanesh Legionaries that are essentially becoming Chosen when they pop that strat.
Yeah.
It's the Chaos Lord because it can be in Chosen.
Yeah.
He's cheap. But the things he adds are really strong in that. The CP manipulation, being able to make a strat free. If you, I know we can't buy CP for points, but we've spoken about this in conversations in the past. If you could buy a CP for a points, you might pay 20, 25 points for CP, for a CP.
Yeah.
The fact that Chaos Lord just makes a strat free, that could be something...
It could be a 2 CP strat as well.
Yeah, it could be the Armor of Contempt style strat.
Yep.
It could be the reroll hits and wound strat. That makes him really powerful. And then his once per game ability to pop off means that he alone can, as we've spoken about, essentially double the output of a Chosen unit.
Well, if you look at it, let's hypothetically say there was a world where you could purchase CP when writing your lists, right? And they cost 25 points each, right? You might buy 1 or 2, right? That Chaos Lord, in one phase, can generate you 2 command points. So he's just paid for 50 points, which means he's only costing you roughly 25 points to put in the list, which is the equivalent of just adding another Chosen to the unit.
That's exactly right. And I think
he hits way harder than another Chosen. So
he's excellent, but I think there is diminishing returns with Lords. I think some people run like 3 Lords. Yeah. I personally don't think 3 Lords is a good option because there is diminishing returns because you can only use that CP ability once per battle round.
Yeah.
So I think Chaos Lords are very strong. They're one of the strongest units in the Codex. And as a result of that, them and Chosen definitely top tier, right? Another top tier unit, which I feel like is something that we've spoken about, and it's something that's kind of emerged over time, is Accursed Cultists.
Yeah.
Accursed Cultists are top tier for a few reasons, but the main reason that makes them so good is that they demand a specific response.
Yeah.
I know that Manny Chima's list, he runs normally 3 units. Yep. I personally don't think 3 units is the right option because if someone's running 3 units and you run into an opponent that knows how to respond to them, they lose effectiveness. But having 1 unit in your list, I think is very powerful because if an opponent can't manage that unit well, and over the course of the game, often what happens is the things that could deal with the accursed units get killed. Yeah. So a strong Chaos player will go, okay, I have my unit of Accursed Cultists. They've got that 1 unit in their army that can kill my Accursed Cultists. If I can deal with that 1 unit, they no longer can kill my Accursed Cultists.
And I think this speaks to the greatest strength of Chaos Space Marines as a faction, is that it's a very diverse army. Like the difference between that Accursed Cultist unit, your Chosen unit, your Forge Fiends, and your Obliterators, they're all very different units, right? And then basically that allows you to do exactly what you've just said. You go, cool, I'm going to use my Chosen to kill the one thing that can kill my Accursed Cultists, and now I can just run amok.
Right.
But if there are multiple things that can kill your Accursed Cultists, you go, okay, cool, I'm going to use my Accursed Cultist to kill the thing that's really effective at dealing with my Chosen. And then my Chosen can run amok.
Yeah.
So because there's all these different elements within the list, it actually really unlocks the faction on that, that
Yeah.
playstyle.
So the Accursed Cultists are definitely a very strong unit. If you can't kill the whole unit, they're going to resurrect 6 models, or they have the opportunity to resurrect 6 models before you get to interact with them again.
Yeah.
Because they resurrect at the start of their command phase and at the start of your command phase.
Yep.
So by the time you get to look at them again, they've resurrected 6 models.
Yep.
They're they blows out of control if you let them let them kind of live. So they are a very strong unit, but players that know how to deal with them, that know, okay, I just need to kill them on sight. As long as I've got a unit that can kill them and I can dictate that trade, they start to lose power quickly, because unlike Chosen, they don't have that like full what's the word? That kind of, when they become attritioned to the point that they're tiny, they become very manageable.
Yeah. Whereas a Chaos Lord and one Chosen running around, it can be an absolute disaster in your backfield.
Exactly.
Whereas a couple of Accursed Cultists that have been whittled down to being almost nothingness,
and they've, for example, they might have used their advance and charge from the commune.
Yeah.
They, and it gets to a point where their OC might not be relevant on that part of the battlefield, and you just can ignore them. Whereas with I'm not saying ignore them, but they are the type of unit that if they're dealt with rapidly, they lose effectiveness.
Yeah.
Okay, so then they're the first 3 units with the Accursed Cultists.
Yep.
I think another really powerful unit that we need to mention is Forge Fiends.
Yeah.
Forge Fiends did get nerfed, but even post-nerf, we see how powerful Devastating Wounds are.
Yeah. Well, because the Devastating Wounds nerf in certain matchups is not actually as bad. Like against Custodies, for example, they used to have the Feel No Pain against Mortal Wounds. Whereas now you're like, well, it's actually better into Custodies than it was previously. And Custodies were previously one of the things that CSM had the potential to struggle into. So it was a nerf in a lot of ways, but I think it was softened more than people really give it credit for.
Right, and I think another thing to mention is, because we've just mentioned, for example, we just touched on how strong Chosen were. The fact that Forge Fiends are good into Chosen means that often Chaos will expect to play a mirror match. They'll go to a tournament and say, well, I might run into another CSM player, so I want to have at least one Forge Fiend, maybe 2 in my list, to be able to kill Chosen. So they are good into each other. They're good into this into the mirror. So that makes them strong just on their own. But we know that they've just got the capacity to blow things up. They're scary. They have access to full rerolls, which is really good as well. So that's probably the top 4 that are S tier units, I would say at the moment. But then there's units that are really good in a list. And for example, the unit that I really like playing, which is the Batten and Terminators, is a very strong unit. So I can kind of group them together. Batten and Terminators is super, super good. It's a unit that can single-handedly win a game over the course of a turn. Like if you kind of ingress the unit, or you have that big turn where you come out or you might resurrect a model. Like they might shoot you and you say, look, I don't have to pop the Nurgle Strat straight away. I can pop the Nurgle Strat, but they're shooting at me with like a small unit.
They kill one Terminator, and then if they go to shoot you again, you pop the Nurgle
Like
Strat
they might,
again.
for example, they might shoot you with a Gladiator Lancer. And they say, here's a Gladiator Lancer. It's going to kill a couple of Termies. And you go, okay, I'm happy to lose two or three Termies. They kill the 2 or 3 Termies. They go to shoot you with a second Gladiator Lancer. Now you pop the Nurgle Strat and you lock out any more damage for the phase. Then in your turn, because you've lost a couple of models from the back of your unit, you can now resurrect them at the front, or one at the front. And if you position your models right, it essentially gains you almost 4 inches of movement.
It's a similar trick to what I used to do with the Master of Possessions, when you deep strike and then you'd stab a guy, kill him, and then resurrect him immediately. That's a similar process there. Only you can't do it to yourself. You require somebody to kill you. But people aren't just going to... If you put the Terminators out in the open, people aren't going to not shoot them.
Well, it depends on how well they know the unit. If they know the unit really well, sometimes they just don't shoot you at all, because they go, I'm not going to give you almost 4 inches of movement for free. So that unit, if it's played well, if it gets to resurrect, advance, shoot charge,
Yeah.
it can kill half their army in one turn.
Yeah.
With shooting and combat, if you position properly, that unit can roll over an army so decisively that the game ends.
Yeah.
There's not many armies that have that ability to do that.
Yeah.
There are things like, for example, the Votan Terminators that are really powerful that can kind of do a similar thing. But the difference is they don't have the flexibility and the access to the wide range of strats that the Chaos do.
Yeah, yeah.
So I wouldn't say that Abby and the Terminators are S tier, because I think for a unit to be S tier, it has to be applicable and playable across a wide range of player skill sets.
Yeah.
And across a wide array of metas. I think at the moment, Abby and Terminators get predated on by the Chaos Lord.
Yeah.
Chaos Lord just goes in and precisions out of Baton.
Yeah.
So you have to play it really, really well in the mirror. So I don't think it's S tier, but it's definitely, I would say, an A tier combo.
Yeah.
Another A tier unit is just the Rhino.
Yeah, rhinos are so underrated, man. They're so underrated. Because, again, sort of like how you were saying that what the Chaos Lord does for the Chosen, or what the Chosen does for the Chaos Lord, is one of the things that takes that unit into S tier. I think similar could be said for the Rhino, right? Like a Rhino with a couple of Legionaries inside of it is trash. But a Rhino with 2 units of 5 Chosen inside of it, both with Chaos Lords, all of a sudden that Rhino is providing massive value.
And you can't run them without the Rhino. So, I mean, some people would say, well, that would make it S tier then. But if a unit can only be used in a certain configuration, requires other units to be S tier, I would kind of say, well, it's more of an A tier unit that is used within an S tier context. Rhinos, very strong, affordable. They're useful with other units inside them as well. Like the firing hatch is a really cool rule we gained.
Yep.
And being able to shoot other weapons, like, for example, a Legionaries, the 12-shot, what's it called?
Cannon.
Chain cannon. That's really cool. Just really nice, flexible unit that's shooting. And I know Chaos players would be nodding their head. Sometimes when you unload a Rhino shooting on people that's got loaded up with things, they can't believe how many shots it's got.
Yeah.
So
because you've got all the weapons on the Rhino itself as well. It's a lot of bullets.
And then it's going to have exploding fives. It's going to be Nurgle.
Yeah.
So then they're like, whoa, what the hell? I'm getting really high quality shooting out of what is a Rhino. So Rhino, definitely an AT unit, and most people have I only run 1 normally, but between 1 and 3 in their list.
Yeah.
You normally would see.
As a World Eaters player, I dread it when I look at my opponent's list and they have like 3 or 4 Rhinos in it, because World Eaters just fundamentally struggle to pop transports, which is just another part of why Rhinos are so good, because World Eaters are pretty relevant in the meta right now. They're doing quite well. So being able to go, cool, all of those armies, including World Eaters, that are prioritizing combat damage, having your combat in a Rhino gives you a massive advantage.
Yeah. So some other kind of AT units that people might be thinking about. The next one I would be Warp Talons. I think Warp Talons are such a cheap, and I think they will at some point go up in points, because when you look at them, 20 points a model.
Yeah.
Like what? They're so good for 20 points.
Yeah.
They're essentially they're a jump pack infantry model. They move through walls, they fly. Not that fly's that good anymore, but it is relevant sometimes.
Well, it's relevant in that you can jump over enemy models. That's the main utility of it.
They can just stage like a normal unit of Chosen or a unit of Legionaries. They just move up and hide and launch from there.
Yep.
So they can be used conventionally. They can ingress and be used aggressively with the Mark of Slanesh to like advance and charge, jump over models and hit their backfield.
Yeah.
They can be used almost as a lone op with the Mark of Nurgle. And
that's my personal favorite way to run them, is use Mark of Nurgle them, and then you can just ingress 12.1 inches away. Mark of Nurgle strat if you want to. They can't shoot you, or you can use them for objective control. You can use them for behind enemy lines, deploy teleport homers, and then you've used the unit for achieving that goal, but then you still have the unit, and it's not insignificant in its damage deal.
Yeah. So. I personally agree. I think Mark of Nurgle is the most... it's kind of very counterintuitive, because people would think, well, they don't have guns, so they're not gaining anything from the benefits to their Marks of Chaos.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter, because on a unit that's that punchy, being able to lone op is crazy.
Yeah.
So...
And particularly if you're not running the Abaddon Terminator combo, right? You might have a couple of Forge Fiends that are Mark of Nurgle, maybe some Obliterators that are Mark of Nurgle, but later in the game, when those things have been dealt with, being able to go, cool, these Warp Talons are going to move in advance, they're going to jump over onto that objective, and now in your turn, you're not going to be able to get within 12 inches of them, and you tell your opponent that, and you say, if you go that direction, I'm just going to Mark of Nurgle. And then often what will happen is they'll go, oh, fuck, good point. So they'll go a different way.
Yeah.
So you don't even have to spend the command points on the stratagem. The fact that you can do it will inform their decision to go a different way. And then,
Yeah.
and then you've just secured that objective just by being able to say, just so you know, they have Mark of Nurgle. I can use that stratagem. That's value in of itself.
Yep, 100%. And I think that Warp Talons, most lists will run at least a unit. I think people play them a little bit, at times play them wrong. They try to play them like Chosen. Like they deep strike them 9 inches away and go for 9-inch long bomb charges and wonder why. They're like, well, my Chosen would have just got in out of a Rhino, so why am I running Warp Talons?
Yeah.
That's not how you should be using them. I think a lot of people just deploy them on the board and run them, like advance them into a ruin, hide them.
Yeah.
They're very useful playing from the board. And if you are going to play them from reserves, you need to be prepared to ingress them.
Yeah.
That's why I think the Mark of Nurgle becomes really powerful, because a lot of people would think, well, if I'm going to run them, of course I'll make them Slanesh to benefit from their, better in combat. But then you're kind of leaning into a win more attitude.
Yeah.
But most of the adversity that occurs with Warp Talons is when they aren't getting a beneficial situation of being able to just unimpededly advance and charge.
And I mean, often you're going to be using them to bully small units anyway, right? You're not going to be using them to try to take out fucking a knight. So whether or not they get a few extra hits is not really going to make or break the unit. You're going to be like, cool, they're going to go into that unit of 10 guardsmen that are on that objective over there. They're going to mince them whether they get the sustained hits or not. So you're better off in the list writing process making them Nurgle to unlock other uses for the unit, to lean into CSM's strength, which is their diversity.
That's exactly right. So then in terms of some other mentions for A tier, I think, and this is where Chaos becomes why it's such a strong faction, I think there's probably, well, at least 3 or 4 characters that you have access to in CSM that are A tier characters. Yep. So those characters would be, and my personal 2 favorites, which have been in my list for a long time, Master of Possession is crazy good character.
Yeah.
The speed on that guy, he moves 8 inches, and a lot of people think, well, 8 inches, well, Possessed move 9, so him moving 8, in some ways, he's slower than Possessed.
Yeah.
But what people don't consider is that he can also join Chosen.
Yeah.
So when you put him in Chosen, he's not lagging behind the Chosen. He's actually running ahead of the Chosen.
He slingshots the Chosen. I did a video on this the other day where I was talking about how not only does he move 2 inches further, but then he gets you the +1 to your advance and charge rolls. So you're essentially getting an extra 4 inches worth of movement on those Chosen, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, there's so many spots, and we've said this in previous videos with you as well, where a lot of people just think, well, 4 inches, and we're not going to, joke about it, but people were like, well, 4 inches isn't that much.
Yeah.
It's a battlefield's massive, like 4 inches. But then when you place terrain and you put your Rhino behind the terrain, where the Rhino would normally be staging, and you say, well, now measure the 4 inches.
Yeah.
And suddenly that 4 inches will get you to spots that you just wouldn't have gone for before. Because you might have gone for that objective, but it would have been an 11-inch charge. Yeah. Now you go for it, you're like, well, now it's a 7-inch charge. Yeah. Now it's worth going for.
Or even just little things like those times when you go for it and you're like, cool, it's a 6-inch charge. Imagine if it was a 2-inch charge.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's the way to conceptualize it. I almost view the mop as when you add him to a Chosen unit, they get +4 inches to their charge moves.
Yeah.
And that's bananas.
It's essentially, it's not exact, it's just slightly under, but the point is that it is wildly powerful.
Yeah.
And then you think, well, the mop must be crap then outside of that, if that's all he's offering, but he's not
He's
crap.
actually got decent combat, decent Dakar.
His Dakar is good, his combat is good, and he also gives the whole unit 6-up feel no pain, which when you are getting shut at by Forge Fiends matters.
Yeah, so as we discussed, because CSM is such a relevant faction right now, it's reasonable to expect, especially if you go into like an 8-round major event, you're going to come into the mirror. You just are. Especially because you're going to be doing quite well, and so are the other CSM players. You're probably going to come into it multiple times. So planning for that mirror match is really important, and the Master of Possessions is fantastic.
There's been times where people do the normal thing where they line up like a Forge Fiend on your 5-man and your mop, right? Because they're used to shooting a 5-man with a Lord.
Yep.
So they line up their Forge Fiend and they say, okay, well, I'm going to pop my Strat on it, and it's just going to evaporate what they're thinking is a 5-man and a Lord equivalent.
Yep.
But then they shoot at the mop, and they don't necessarily factor in that that's a significantly more tough unit now.
Yeah.
Because even against the dev wounds, you're getting that feel no pain.
Yeah.
So I've had times where opponents done that, they've shot me, they've expected to clear the unit out, or maybe leave the Lord alive on his own.
Yeah.
But
and they've killed like 2 or 3.
Killed maybe 3 sometimes, and you go, well, now I've got 2 and a mop left that's actually now a very useful unit still.
Yeah, and like we said at the start, like with the Chosen, 2 chosen in a character is a huge problem, because generally that's going to be the power fist. You're going to keep your better unit models alive, and you've still got the character, so you still get advance and charge on the character. Very good.
So Mops A tier, you got Fabulous Bill, and I've once again run him for a while. I think the thing about Fabius that people don't factor in, they don't consider, is that this almost every time I run him, and you put him in a unit of chosen, 5 or 10 man is modular. Like if you're running a list with a 10 man chosen, 2 5-mans, and you have, for example, my list will have Fabius, a Mop, and a Lord.
Yeah.
I can decide which one takes the 10 man.
Correct. And certain matchups, the Lord is going to be really valuable, because your opponent might have a whole bunch of AP1, and you're like, cool, well, if I put the Lord in there and get free Armor of Contempt whenever I want it, that's really relevant. Or there might be some situations where you're like, my opponent is a combat heavy list, so me being able to put the Mop in the big unit means that I'll have a bigger threat range than they will, which means I'll be able to stage myself safe and they can't do the same thing. Or you put Fabius in there, and what Fabius does is gives you the +1 strength and toughness, which means if your opponent is rocking a whole ton of strength 4, strength 5, strength 10 weapons, strength 8 weapons, all of a sudden that extra toughness makes the unit way more durable. Or if they have a whole bunch of stuff that is
T5
toughness
themselves,
10, toughness 5, toughness, that all of toughness 3 things, all of a sudden you're winning them all on
or T11, which is a relevant breakpoint, because some people think, T11 it's a really interesting breakpoint. But when you push yourself to strength 6, suddenly you're winning T11 on 5s, and you have access to 4 rerolls. So the point is that I think Fabius is A tier. I think the amount of things he brings to a list sequentially make him a really strong package. And we've spoken about this in the past when we talked about, because he's got his little gimp, and he ignores per battle rounder. Per turn.
He has the capacity to ignore damage.
Per turn ignores a damage. Like that means that between those two, you're essentially saving at least 2 chosen.
Yeah.
And then you add those together and you go, okay, well, if he gets residual value from that, it starts to snowball.
Yeah. So he provides a similar defensive buff than what we were talking about with the Master of Possessions. The difference is Fabius is even more so, because it doesn't matter how much damage you're getting hit by. Whereas the Master of Possessions, he only really protects you against 3 damage weapons. Because if you're getting hit by multiple lots of 2 damage, the 6-up Field of Pain is not likely to save anything. And if you're getting by like 4 damage weapons, it's also not likely to save anything. Whereas Fabius, he'll save you against a 10 damage shot. It's just going to be like, nope.
Yeah, so he's very good. And I think he's very useful once you've played a couple of games with him and you realize the way to use him and where to put him. You're not always just going to put him in the same unit. Yeah. There'll be games where you go, you know what, this game I'm going to put him on his own. Because this game, just the fact that he has Resurrect means that he's really annoying.
Yeah. It allows him to function similar to a lone op, where it's like, I'm going to put him out on this objective, and it's like, yeah, you can shoot him, but then at the end of the phase, he's just going to come straight back up.
Yeah. I mean, that Resurrect actually doesn't happen at the end of the phase. It happens...
it's immediately.
It's immediately. Is something we had to clarify recently, but like, it's still really useful because he's got 5-up F&P.
Yeah.
So people think like, they kind of in their mind have this amount of damage that will take to kill a character.
Yeah.
But that doesn't work through F&P, through an ignore damage, and through a Resurrect. Like, it's just not, you're not gonna kill him.
Yeah.
So he's really, really good. I think he's definitely A tier, and he's definitely something that people should at least consider to have in their list. I think the reason why people don't have him is just because Lords exist.
Yeah.
And people kind of just go, all right, 3 Lords, I'm done. But what I would say to those people is, okay, fine. A Lord is individually better unit than Fabius or the Mott potentially. But once you have 1 or 2 Lords, you have that kind of like diminishing marginal utility.
Yeah.
Where the 3rd Lord might not be as good as the 1st, but Fabius is better than the 3rd Lord.
Exactly. It's sort of like how, like if you've got a missus and she's a blonde and you're like, that's amazing. If you had 3 missuses, would you want 3 blondes or would you want a brunette and a redhead?
No comment. But anyway, so I think, they're definitely A tier. But then as Dean said earlier, you go, okay, what about Chaos Demons, right? Like, Chaos Demons have Blue Scribe, Celeste, and Changeling that are all really, really good characters. I think they're all A tier characters.
I think it's worth mentioning at this point that, like, because we've just listed, like, the top, 10-odd units.
Yeah.
And probably 50% of them are characters, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, when you're writing a list, you don't want to just pack it full of just characters, because not only are you making yourself vulnerable to somebody taking fixed objectives and assassinate, but you're also just rewarding them for when they draw Assassinate, because the chances of them getting it is like 100%, right? So there's a few problems there. And then also, if you have a billion characters running around, you've got less units able to do actions and secondaries and things like that. What's your take, before we go on to the remaining units available, on the appropriate number of characters in a list?
I mean, it's a good point. I personally don't like taking more than 5. I think 5's fine, because to max Assassinate, they basically need to kill all your characters. Obviously, if you have someone like Celeste that comes back, they can farm it, or Fabius. But in that situation, if they pick Assassinate and you have Fabius or you have Celeste, you're not going to play with that character like you normally would.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to deep strike Celeste aggressively and let him get 2 Assassinate points. Let him get 8 VP from you.
Yeah.
So they have to take the choice. If they pick Assassinate, are you just going to adapt your playstyle and protect your characters?
Yeah.
So I think 4 to 5 characters is fine. I generally don't go to 6. I think going to 6 makes the Assassinate fixed choice too rewarding for them.
Yeah.
Because they'll get to not only kill characters and get points, but they get to manipulate your playstyle and force you into a defensive posture, which they can manipulate in their own benefit.
Yeah.
So I think going 5 and under is fine. But if you have someone like Fabius or Celeste, it kind of counts as 2.
Yeah.
But if they do pick Assassinate into a Fabius, then you would just not join him into a unit like this. So say you take Fabius Bile, and that takes you to your 5th character.
Yep.
So you might have 3 Lords, Fabius, and a Changeling, hypothetically.
Yep.
Or like the character in a commune, right? So you've got a commune, 3 Lords, and Fabius.
Yep.
If they pick Assassinate into you, then you just do not attach Fabius to the chosen unit, and you just run him on his own, and you just hide him and use him as like a backfield guard.
Yep.
You put him on your backfield objective, you just use him as a guardian of the backfield, and you use your chosen unit without a character.
Yeah. One of my favorite things to do back in 9th edition, which is still potentially relevant today, a little bit less because characters are expensive, but the World Eater's Master of Executions was a really, really cheap character. So what I would do is I'd take 3 in a list, so that my opponent, when reading my list before the game starts, would select Assassinate as a secondary, and then I'd just put all 3 of them in strategic reserves, and then just be like, cool, I'm playing with just Angron running around. You can kill him, you'll get your 5 points there, but I'm never giving you those 3.
Yeah.
I'm going to wait until turn 3, and then I'm going to put them in the safest area of the table, and now I've just spent a couple hundred points, to almost zero out your secondary.
Yeah, it is a very, very high level. I think when people pick Assassinate, they're really backing themselves.
Yeah.
But I do think that with someone like, for example, like a Chaos Lord, like if a Chaos Lord really wants to be involved in the thick of things to get its value, so I think there is probably a limit to characters where you start to lose value. And I think
the way to think of it, I think, is to just go, okay, if I hide this character, if I take this character, throw him in strat reserves, don't bring him on till turn 3. If I can guarantee that my opponent's not going to kill this character, right, that's going to be 5 points less that my opponent gets, right? So in order to justify adding that character to a unit, needs to, at the very least, generate you 5 points that you would have otherwise not.
Well, and another way to consider it, though, is and you're assuming there with the cost of the 5 points is in tactical, but in fixed it's 4.
Yep.
But you still need to have only 5 or less. Whereas if you have 7 or 8 characters, you saving a character doesn't necessarily save you points.
So you either go. I think you either go 3 to 4 or 30.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing.
Once you cross that threshold, you might as well just double down.
But that's why I think once you cross the threshold and you have 7 or 8 characters and you're basically giving away Assassinate, I don't think that's a winning play, unless you have an army that's going to table your opponent very quickly. But there's not really anything in the meta that does that.
Yeah.
So I think you just stick to 5 or less, which you can do easily in Chaos. You just have to pick. So where we said, I just mentioned there's all these characters, you're not going to take all of them.
Correct.
Like I think a normal list might have, for example, something like a Chaos Lord and a Mop, 2 Chaos Lords and a Mop, or 2 Chaos Lords and Fabius.
Yep.
Then you go, I'll take Changeling or Blue Scribes.
Yeah.
But you don't go 2 Chaos Lords, Fabius, Mop, Blue Scribes, Changeling. Like you end up at that point.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the reasons that Chaos Space Marines are considered an S tier faction, is because you've got 15 odd A tier units to select from.
Yeah.
But you're never going to take all of them, right? Whereas something like the World Eaters, it's like, okay, cool, your A tier units are Angron, 8-bound, and Master of Executions. So you just max out on that because you don't have a billion choices. CSM have more choices.
And I think that's the thing with Chaos. Like, we could keep going with our tier list. Like, the only other unit, there's probably 1 or 2 more units we could discuss to round out our kind of top units.
Yep.
I think Legionaries actually go into that list. And the reason why Legionary is good, and they've been popularized recently, I want to give the credit to the right person, but the person I saw run 3 in their list that I was a bit like, oh, that's interesting, was Manny Chima when he played in that Warhammer Championships. I'm sure there were people running lots of units before them. I'm not sure who, so I don't want to misattribute credit. But the thing about Legionaries that's useful is when you give them the Mark of Slaanesh, and then you kind of go, well, they're kind of like Chosen, budget Chosen.
Yeah.
Because the reason we like Chosen is that they hit pretty hard, they have access to powerful stratagems, they advance and charge, they fall back and charge and shoot as well, so they can do actions in a way that is better than average. They also have the ability to like come out and put relevant shooting into things like Chosen. I didn't mention this before, but Chosen actually have pretty decent shooting, respectable shooting.
Particularly into infantry, but
so do Legionaries, because Legionaries, they pack that chain
Yep.
cannon and, throw in a couple of other little guns and they're suddenly shooting reasonably well. So they actually are relevant. And I think the thing that makes Chosen quite powerful is a combination of their 2 OC and their reroll wounds on objectives.
You mean Legionaries, you said.
Sorry, Legionaries. Yeah, so Legionaries, they go in, you might be planning to pop your reroll strat somewhere else.
Yep.
And you go, okay, but these Chosen are charging onto an objective. They might be charging a chaff unit, so a unit that's like, for example, say they charge into like 2 Sword Brethren or 2 Aggressors.
Yeah.
And you go, okay, my opponent is not, if they interrupt, is not going to kill enough Legionaries to win the objective back. They might kill a few, but they're not going to win the objective back off me.
Yeah.
So they're not going to interrupt. They're not likely enough to win the objective back off to justify an interrupt. So you throwing those Legionaries into that unit effectively achieves the same as charging the Chosen in, because you're just denying the objective.
Yeah.
Both units would evaporate next turn.
Yeah.
So either unit's on a suicide mission, but the Legionaries are doing the same thing, achieving the same goal. They wouldn't be able to necessarily do that if they were OC1. So it's a combination of the reroll wounds and OC2, and access to the Armor of Contempt strap, because they might say, oh, I'm going to interrupt to try to kill you, but you then say, I'm going to Armor of Contempt, so now you don't.
Yeah, so I think there's a world where there's a list that has your 3 units of Chosen and a unit of Legionaries, and then Lords, Master of Possessions, and Fabius. And there'll be some games where you'll go, I'm going to put the Lord with the Legionaries. There's some times where you'll be like, you know what, the Master of Possession is not particularly relevant in this game, so I'll put him with the Legionaries.
Yeah, and even in my list, like, I've considered running 5 Legionaries as a backup for Abaddon, because you can go, Abaddon can't join Chosen. If he could, then that's what people would run a lot of. But you put him in your termies, but you go, oh, this game, I'm playing against a list that really, like, can deal with the death ball.
Yeah.
So I'm going to detach Abaddon from the termies, put him with 5 Legionaries.
Yeah.
And now he's a different unit.
Yeah.
So...
And a Chaos Lord in those Terminators is actually quite interesting, because being able to get the free Armor of Contempt on them makes those Terminators really hard to deal with. Being able to go calling in a Nurgle strat and Armor of Contempt, so now you're neg 1 to hit and neg 1 to your AP. People just are not going to chew through those Terminators.
That's the thing, and I think with Chaos, we have had the benefit over the last, 8 months it's been, whatever it's been since...
Alrighty, we've just taken a quick break, recharged the microphones. We were talking about some alternative options, some honorable mentions. You were talking about Abaddon and the ability he has to add to multiple different things. You want to sort of pick us up from where we left off?
Yeah, so it's kind of the last thing we had in A tier, at the bottom of A tier, is Legionaries, that are, just because they're flexible, they've got good OC, they have access to good strats, they're not expensive. So they are definitely, I would say, A tier. They will function well in an army, and you'll be happy you took a unit or 2. Now, looking at honorable mentions, Chaos have a very, very broad and big S and A tier, as you could see. And a lot of the units that I'm going to mention now, people might think are A tier, or could, like, situationally in the right meta or the right environment, be A tier. So a couple of honorable mentions. The first one is a sad drop-off from previous S tier was Obliterators. Obliterators were very powerful when they were a little bit cheaper, and I really liked their ability to overwatch with indirect.
Yes.
Their indirect ability was so strong in Overwatch that I would have them in S tier and happily take them with Abaddon.
Yep.
But I think a combination of Abaddon being nerfed, being reduced in, increased in points, as well as the general meta and their points increase as well, have pushed Obliterators into B tier.
Yeah, I personally think that the only real way to get utility out of Obliterators now is you kind of require Abaddon. They need to be Mark of Nurgle, and the way that I would recommend playing them is you drop them so that they're in direct line of sight of something that you want to kill, and you use the indirect to kill something else. And then as soon as your opponent goes to move that thing that you wanted to kill, you Overwatch and kill that.
So you reverse,
You actually reverse the order of operations.
Yeah, and then you still have the Nurgle strat so that you can kind of keep them alive a turn. Yeah, I like that. And I think in a list with Abby, they can be A tier because you have access to that, for example. Another unit that's really powerful, a character, not surprisingly, is Lucius the Eternal. Fights first, and someone, World Eaters player, you can probably attest to how strong Fights First is in this edition.
It's pretty bananas. There's certain matchups where having the capacity to Fights First it presents your opponent with a massive challenge. So in the World Eaters, I often run Khan and a Master of Executions, and then depending on who I'm versing, I'll either add Khan to the Berserkers or the Master of Executions. And generally, if my opponent's like Sisters of Battle or something else that has, like even CSM where they've got they're prioritizing combat damage, being able to just go, yeah, well, I always Fights First. I'm behind this wall, you can't see me, you can't shoot me, and if you charge me, you die.
Yeah.
It creates this network that's really hard.
And I think a lot of people, when they think of Lucius, they think, oh, he's Slanesh, so he'd go with Noise Marines. But he's actually most powerful in Legionaries because you're putting him in Legionaries, you're putting him, as you said, on a safe objective, hidden, so your opponent can only really access him to dislodge all that OC through combat, but then they fight first. So you have Legionaries that are on an objective, so they're going to be re-rolling wounds. With Lucius, it's just a very powerful, cost-efficient nugget that they have to unravel, which is very difficult to do for cost.
Lucius, as the meta evolves, that's going to become more and less relevant. I think that's one of the reason that you wouldn't put that in S tier or even necessarily in A tier is because it's so meta dependent.
It's meta dependent, and also we've already talked about how cluttered the top slots of characters are for Chaos. Finding space for Lucius is difficult in an environment where you're trying to dodge Assassinate. I think things that could change would be the way secondaries work. If Assassinate becomes less predatory, you might be able to do that. Also, he's 95 points. And he hits in a weaker kind of fashion than a Lord. If he dropped down to 75, 80 points, and Lords went up, which they likely will, then Lucius becomes an option.
More attractive choice,
all right, so I think the last thing I'll say for B tier is you might have noticed from the units we're talking about so far is that we haven't really included any nonsense prattle kind of trash units in our list. All our units have been, apart from maybe Legionaries and Rhinos, quite strong units, but any list needs nonsense objective scoring units.
You need the grunts. You need the people that are
going
to work.
So I'll list about 5 units of which you need to have some in your list. So someone would argue based on the way that people do tier rankings that would make these units A tier. But once again, I think because there's so many options and none of them standalone are amazing, they are a very safe B tier that you put in your list, but you're only going to put a couple of these in your list because they're not amazing on their own.
So I would describe this as they're relatively B tier. In that if you were to put them in Codex World Eaters, they would immediately become an A tier within that faction. But because CSM, we're comparing to other CSM units, in that environment, they are more or less.
So the people will probably guess what these units are. From the CSM book, there would be units like the normal cultists, regular cultists, that you needed. I think every list should have one unit because you need it on your backfield, sticking in the backfield, and then they screen out your back because there's a big footprint and they can screen out with. They're just a very powerful use of 55 points.
They exist in an interesting environment where they're a must take, but you wouldn't take 20 of them. Right?
No.
Whereas Chosen are a must take, and you probably want to take 3.
That's right.
So they're a must take, but they're not.
Probably just 1 or 2 units of cultists. Another unit in a similar fashion, which people will less regularly take, would be Raptors. Raptors are really good. They're fast. They can access the Mark of Nurgle with shooting, with melter guns and stuff. I think they're a very strong unit. I think if things like Warp Talons and other quick objective takers get nerfed, we might see Raptors pick up the slack.
I think the Raptor Warp Talon dynamic is an interesting one in that basically when you're running your list, every now and then you'll write a list where you're like, oh, I'm 10 points over, or I'm 20 points under. That's when you just go, cool, I'm going to turn the Raptors into Warp Talons. Or I'm just going to turn the Warp
that's
Talons
the
into
thing.
Raptors.
It's like for
and
10...
they fill a very similar role. They do similar stuff. Obviously not quite the same and not quite as efficiently, but that's one of the ways that you can play.
Yeah, and the thing is like in a world where Warp Talons are only 100 points, taking Raptors for 90 feels a bit like, it feels a bit
yikes.
A bit yikes. But if Warp Talons go back to 110, 115, and say Raptors go down to 85, well then everyone just takes Raptors for that cheap Action Monkey unit.
Yep.
Then speaking of cheap Action Monkeys, most people default to Demons because you have access to like so many cheap good units.
Yep.
We've already been through the characters, so like Blue Scribes is a favorite. But then you have things like Nurglings for 35 points are really useful to do things like they might do something like an area denial, they might do a behind enemy lines, they might do they might cleanse if you're already putting other units onto the objective to control it. They'll just be the ones that actually do the cleanse.
So the Nurglings, I like running the Nurglings with the Chosen around as like a nugget, because then the Nurglings and the Chosen can move on to an objective. The Nurglings are going to cleanse it and the Chosen are going to kill something.
Yeah.
Right?
Perfect.
The other thing that Nurglings can do is obviously infiltrate, which allows you to play around with a lot of different screening and the area denial sort of stuff, not in the objective sense, but in the practical sense, trying to deny your opponent access to certain areas of the table. Nurglings are very good at that.
Yep, and then you have demons that I think are really good, but I don't really see. Things like Seekers of Slanesh,
Yes.
Fleshhounds, Screamers.
Yep.
There's actually a plethora
Fiends
of
Slanesh.
sorry, I meant Fiends. Since I said Seekers, I meant Fiends.
Yeah,
Fiends are the ones on the mounted ones.
Yeah, they're like the
Yeah, sorry. Fiends, they basically, they are so fast and hit hard enough for such an affordable price that I think people should run more of them. We've spoken about it in videos. Flesh Hounds are only 70 points and they are beasts, which means they can move through walls, which makes them really powerful.
And they've actually, when they string out, because they're on those long oval bases, they actually cover like a massive area. If you're versing like Chaos Knights or something, and you know that they're going to be able to move on to this objective, you can just go, cool, I'm going to put my Flesh Hounds like this, and now they have to spend a strat to be able to get past you. You can really slow them down.
Yeah.
Flesh Hounds are really good.
So any list that wants to run cheap units, and some people, and this is something I've recently done in some of my list writing, is I would recently default to Blue Scribes because of just Blue Scribes being that kind of cheap nonsense unit. The problem with Blue Scribes, like we discussed earlier, is it's a character that you might not want to have that, because often when you're screening or using them as an objective taker, then your opponent draws Assassinate, and that's a free, easy 5 points. Whereas if you didn't have Blue Scribes, suddenly they would have had to dig out a Lord or dig out Abbey or dig out something that it's a lot harder to do.
And chances are in the first couple of turns, they're not going to have the capacity to do it. So if they draw Assassinate in turn 1 or 2, you're like, cool. They're probably going to...
They'll discard
They're probably going to discard it.
Whereas if you have Blue Scribes, they score it.
Yeah.
So I've been contemplating replacing Blue Scribes with something like a unit of Flesh Hounds or a unit of the Fiends, because they're around the same price. They're not characters.
Yep.
So you're kind of trading off the Lone Op rule for not having a character. And I think in like previous points in the edition, people would have happily just taken the Lone Op rule. But I think as the edition's evolved, people have worked out how to deal with Lone Ops. They have fast, responsive, cheap units in their army that if you try to do a Lone Op strat, they'll like a Lone Op kind of play. They can sling something to the objective, kill the Lone Op, and hold the objective. So I think the Lone Ops have lost value as the edition's progressed.
Particularly in the mirror match, because like we've said, that's something that you have to plan for. When you're the top tier faction, you have to plan for the mirror match, and CSM are quite good at dealing with enemy Lone Ops, because you have the capacity to launch out those Chosen and just solve that problem.
Yep.
One of the other ones that we discussed was Vindicators. Now, the Vindicator, when you look at it, it seems a bit meh, but I like to think of it kind of like if you're taking 1 or 2 Forge Fiends, the Vindicator can kind of fill the slot for that second or third Forge Fiend. And what it does is it fills a similar role in the way that it's probably going to either pop out from behind line of sight or it's going to come on from strategic reserves. It's going to do 1 good volley of shooting damage and then probably be dealt with, right? Because that's how the second Forge Fiend generally operates. But the Vindicator has a different damage profile, which means it's less vulnerable to the things that Forge Fiends are vulnerable to, and more effective at other things. Like if you're hitting something that's got 24 wounds, you'd probably rather shoot it with a Vindicator. If it's toughness 11, 24 wounds, you'd rather shoot it with a Vindicator than a Forge Fiend. Or if you're shooting something that's like 4 wounds a pop, where the 3 damage from the Forge Fiend isn't particularly useful, but that variable damage from the Vindicator is. And then also the Vindicator's got a 2-up save, and toughness 11.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit tougher than the Forge Fiend. I think it fills a similar role, and if a Forge Fiend is S tier, and a Vindicator is similar, it feels like it would be wrong not to consider.
Yeah, I think that's a
in one of
great
the upper
point.
tiers.
And I think what keeps the Forge Fiend as the premier shooting unit you have in your army is because of how good it is in the mirror match.
Yeah.
And also how scary it is because of the variance. Like it's
bananas.
scary because it can go bananas, and also the dev wounds can go bananas. But also it can just kill itself. Like we've all played games where you shoot your volley, you fail your leadership test, so you lose D3, dark pack,
D3, and then you fail one of your hazard
Yep.
tests, and all of a sudden you've just half killed.
You've gone from 12 wounds to 5 wounds, and you're like, from 12 wounds to 7 wounds, and you're like, cool, I'm on 7 wounds now.
Yep.
Whereas the Vindicator is not going to have that problem. Doesn't have the same like ceiling of damage it can do.
Yeah.
But I think if Chosen get nerfed and the meta starts to change, because we, as you said, start seeing more foil wound models, more mech, Vindicator becomes a really good option.
Yeah.
Because you still can pop the same strat on it. It can still reroll hits and wounds. Still has access to lots of shots.
Yep.
It's got it can high roll a little bit.
Yep. And if you the other thing about the mirror match is if you're versing Chaos Space Marine players that don't have Fabius, right? So they're all toughness strength 5 on their Chosen. Being go to a toughness 11 is pretty good because the inability to go to strength 6 means
There are some things that hate T11, as we know from the problem now with Catans and just how people are really struggling with the T11. It's the same premise. But I think before we round it out, I mean, we could keep going. And I think the thing about Chaos is that it's got the Dark Pact rule, the marks of Chaos and being able to Dark Pact is such a strong thing, such a strong rule that even going down into units we haven't mentioned,
they are good.
They still have capacity. Like someone might run a unit of Havocs, for example, and Havocs can be really cool because you might pop the marker Nurgle and just shoot from backfield with exploding 5s on a Daka unit. That's good.
Yeah.
So
Predators are another one.
Yeah.
Like a Predator, you look at it and you're like, it's kind of meh. But it's still like 130 points for a bunch of bullets that are going to shoot down range, hard to deal with in return, that are going to be exploding 5s. Land Raiders are another one that's like, probably a lower B tier, maybe upper C tier.
Yeah. So you can keep going, but I think what should be hardening for Chaos players is that the actual core rule of the current rules they have, like the Dark Pacts, Marks of Chaos, such a nice rule, such a powerful rule that you can happily draw on units we haven't mentioned.
Yep.
And still have success with them because they're coming from a really strong base.
Yep. Fantastic. All right. So we've covered the current state of the faction. We'll probably spend another 5 minutes talking about this, so we'll try to keep our thoughts succinct. But what are your thoughts on the balanced data slate? Do you think that points should go up? Do you think that Dark Pacts should be changed? Do you think that what are your thoughts on? Is there any abilities that you think should be changed? What are your?
I think the Dark
thoughts?
Pact change will happen in the Codex because obviously there's going to be more detachments, and the Dark Pacts are just the current benefit. So they might still be a fact.
The Dark Pact is the faction rule, correct?
And its Marks of Chaos is the
detachment, which doesn't really make sense because does that mean other detachments can't dedicate to certain gods?
I don't know exactly. And I think it'll all change in the Codex. And I think in Codex, my recommendation to GW would be just remove this rule. I think the rule's too strong. I think it's too toxic. It's what's creating such a difficult to balance situation because you look at something like a Forge Fiend. I've had situations where a Forge Fiend has rolled 3 shots and done nothing, and then you have it roll 9 shots and blow up a whole unit of, like, for example, like 10, like Terminators. So the variability of what the explodes, especially exploding on 5s, does is toxic.
Yeah. How do you attribute an appropriate points cost to something that could kill nothing or everything?
It's also hard.
How do you do that?
Because when you factor in the critical hits for like lethals and sustain, it hits everything. It doesn't have a weakness. It's just always good. Yeah. So it's like, well, I can just go lethals when I don't want to go sustained. So I feel like that needs to be rebalanced, but that's not something that we're doing a data slate. That's a Codex thing.
Yep.
I think the data slate, as simple as Chaos Lords go up to 100 points from 75, they're too cheap. They're too strong. Bump their points up. Change the strat to reroll hits and wounds from 1 CP to 2 CP.
Yep.
Comboing that with the Chaos Lords change makes that strat a lot less powerful. I think you need to do those together.
Because it simultaneously means that you have to take Chaos Lords because that strat's now 2 CP, but simultaneously taking Chaos Lords is more expensive, so you're disincentivized.
100%. Those two need to happen together because if you don't do them together, if you nerf Chaos Lords on their own, well, the strat's still super powerful for 1 CP.
And people just take Mop and
they take Mop, Fabius, all Huron. They go to all these other characters. But so you need to do those together. That's the dual nerf. And then the other thing that needs to happen is Chosen just need to go up in points.
Yeah.
So they're just way too cheap. The data sheet's okay if instead of costing, I think there are, what are they, 22 point, whatever they are per model, put them up 3 points a model so the unit goes up 15 to 20 points for the unit is fine.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we've just spent the last 45 minutes talking about, all of the different things that are amazing in the faction, and the one consistent thread was Chosen. Because Chosen make Lords relevant. Chosen make the Master of Possessions relevant. Chosen make Rhinos relevant. If they can fix that, then I think the faction will fall in line with everything else. And then it's also worth noting, and a lot of people miss this when talking about proposed changes to the data slate, is they talk about nerfing one faction, but they discount the fact that other factions are going to get a buff. So a slight nerf to CSM by just fixing just the Chosen. Yeah, Forge Fiends are still going to be bananas. Yeah, Abaddon Terminator is still going to be bananas, but that's okay. Just nerf that one OP combo and just buff the other factions a little bit so that they become relevant, and now you have a stable meta. So yeah, that'll be my thoughts. So I think we're on the same page there. So all right, well, we'll finish it here. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, David.
And we'll definitely do this again. Maybe before Uprising, we'll do a video talking about our lists that we've devised based on what we've discussed here. We'll do a similar video to this for World Eaters.
Yep, sounds good, man.
And here, we'll take it then. All right, cool.
Cheers.
Walk for the Blood God.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable,